The purpose of the Blaine amendments was to prevent government money from going to Catholic schools and institutions. Ooh, that doesn't sound very good. And yet, the word Catholic doesn't appear anywhere in there. It's any religious purpose whatsoever is in there. This sort of sentiment persisted interestingly enough, also researching this. I am the president of the local chapter of Americans United for Separation of Church and State. I think it's an excellent organization, obviously, and I think it's, you know, one of the battalions in the forces of light. But it started out as an organization called Protestants United for Separation of Church and State. And even though it was a little bit less straightforward, shall we say, than Blaine was about 60 years earlier, a lot of the founders of Protestants United for Separation of Church and State were afraid that in many places, Catholic organizations were too successful in getting government money to support their schools. And so they wanted to sort of hammer home this idea of separation of church and state. One of the reasons I bring this up is because some people on the Budget and Tax Commission who are Catholic, like Jeb Bush, claim that they want to get rid of the Blaine Amendment because it's anti-Catholic. It is anti-religious. It violates the principle of the Constitution. That's his argument. And when you know the history, you say, whoa, wow, how did that happen? It seems so logical. It seems so straightforward. It seems so unprejudiced because it applies to everybody. Well, in point of fact, that's what the courts now believe. I don't expect you to read the whole PowerPoint up there. I get a little carried away with the PowerPoints. But according to a law professor at George Washington University, he said this in an interview with the Pew Foundation. You can find it online. Although the Blaine Amendments appear to stem from prejudice against Catholic immigrants, none of the amendments actually mention the Catholic faith or any tradition or denomination in particular. Rather, all Blaine Amendments are textually neutral because they apply equally to all religious traditions and denominations. And he further goes on to point out, still some anti-Blaine organizations, like the Becket Fund, have challenged the Blaine Amendments on the basis of historical motivation. The Becket Fund claims that the Blaine Amendments are unconstitutional because their creation stemmed from prejudice against Catholicism. But no court has accepted this argument because now that public schools no longer have a Protestant character, which they did before, the Blaine Amendments no longer function in a way that favors or disfavors particular religious groups. A somewhat questionable movement has created something that actually starts to protect everybody. And as some of you sort of moaned or snickered or whatever your response was, when I mentioned that the Baptists, for much of the history of the United States, were staunch supporters of separation of church and state, circumstances sometimes change. But the principle remains the same. The Baptists could support it and then somehow turn against it. That doesn't undermine the principle. In the case of Blaine, Blaine was using the principle but manipulating. He was doing his own little stealth program. But in the end, the net effect is to reinforce what James Madison and Thomas Jefferson wanted, which is to say this applies to everybody and ultimately protects everybody. It's an uncomfortable truth. It's not easy. But if you ever get into an argument with somebody who wanted Amendments 7 and 9 and they say, well, what we want to do is get rid of an anti-religious and prejudiced amendment, you'll know what they're talking about, and you'll be able to argue against it. Well, the first time I heard that, I was floored. I didn't have anything to say. I was like, how does that work? Well, that is how that works, and that is part of the arsenal. Am I going the right way? Yes. Okay, I'm going to skip that. Talking about the amendments and getting to Amendment 2. Amendment 2, the amendment that is trying to outlaw gay marriage, which is also trying to outlaw civil unions, which is also trying to, or could have the effect of creating a situation where people in all sorts of other circumstances are not going to be able to enjoy benefits that they enjoy now, which has nothing to do with the whole question of same-sex marriage, etc. This amendment comes together with 7 and 9. The source is different. The source is from an initiative. 7 and 9 are from the Budget and Taxation Commission, but they come in a package. And the supporters of 7 and 9 tend to be the supporters of 2 as well. The opponents of 7 and 9 tend to be the opponents of 2 as well. So we have to talk about what's going on. I want to talk about it in terms of what it could do, what it has done in other states, what the supporters say it does and doesn't do, what the opponents say it does and doesn't do, and then talk about the extent to which it's a separation issue. It's not merely a separation of church and state issue. It's a lot of things going on, but it is, I believe, a separation of church and state issue. The key to my argument, I'm not going to argue about the original definition of, itself, that marriage is just a legal union of a man and a woman, period, end of story. I don't happen to agree with that. I don't happen to think it's right. I think, though, that a lot of different people can agree or can disagree on that for a lot of different reasons, not solely, or at least not overtly, for religious reasons. I think a lot of people are just sort of uncomfortable with it. I think it's unfortunate. I think they should be shown that it's not a threat or whatever. But if it were only that, we should still oppose it. But it's more than that, and that's really the key. Because it says, no other legal union that is treated as marriage or the substantial equivalent thereof shall be valid or recognized. The substantial equivalent thereof. What is the substantial equivalent thereof? Well, one of the substantial equivalents thereof is civil union. Those places that couldn't quite agree that there should be same-sex marriage said, well, we can do something that's almost but not quite and have the civil unions. This has happened in other places. In France, France has something called the PACS, the Association Partenaire, where two people can enter into a legally recognized union, which is not the same as marriage, and get certain benefits that they wouldn't otherwise get as married couples would get. And most of the people that were benefited by this in France were gays.